Okay. Well, good evening from London, where it's now started to rain after a very sultry couple of days. Welcome to the latest in our Harif lockdown lectures. It's lovely to see you all here again. Harif, for those who don't know us, is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Our aim is to raise awareness of the history and culture of these Jews, but of course you don't need to be one in order to be interested in the subject. Do visit our website, which is www.harif.org. And also please visit our Point of No Return blog, which has just been relaunched today. And you can get to it by typing in Jewish refugees, all in one word, .org.uk. Very exciting for us today. The event today is being recorded on Facebook. I hope it stays there. And it's also going to be available on YouTube. We do have a YouTube channel, a Harif YouTube channel, and you can access that through the Harif website. If you do have any comments or questions for our speaker, please do write them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The subject of today's lecture is the Judeo-Arabic heritage. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome back Dr. Norman Stillman to tell us about it. I know it's a subject very close to his heart. Dr. Stillman is Emeritus Professor and Chair of Judaic History at the University of Oklahoma. He now lives in Jerusalem. He specializes in the intersection of Jewish and Islamic culture and history, with special interest in the Jewish communities of North Africa. His major publications are The Jews of Arab Lands, which I have here, 2 volumes, an absolute classic, and also Sephardi Religious Responses to Modernity. He has been executive editor of the Encyclopedia of Jews in the Islamic World, a project that includes over 2,000 entries in 5 volumes. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Stillman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I could also call this talk When Arabic was a Jewish language. And if you'll permit me, I would like to start with 2 personal reflections, anecdotes. 55 years ago, I brought my fiancée, who had been born in Morocco and raised in Israel, home to meet my family in the United States. And I'll never forget the moment when she met my grandmother. My grandmother, whose English, even after 50 years in the US, was still heavily accented, asked my fiancé, "Does your family speak Jewish?" Not understanding what she meant, my bride-to-be replied, "Of course, we all speak Hebrew. That's the language of Israel." No, my grandmother said, "Not Ivris. Does your family speak Yiddish?" "Ah," my fiancé exclaimed. "No, not Yiddish. We have our own Jewish, Judeo-Arabic, Jewish Arabic." My poor grandmother was totally bewildered. For her, Yiddish, which literally is the word Jewish, but short for Yiddish-Teich, Judeo-German, or better Judeo-Germanic, was Mamaloshen, the mother tongue. It was thought of by East European Jews, such as her, as essentially Jewish. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, in fact, there were even those who actively opposed the revival of Hebrew as a living language for a national modern movement. Because although Hebrew was Lashon Kodesh, or as my grandmother would have said, Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue, it was not the people's language, at least not the language of the East European Jewish masses. If you'll permit me one more personal experience, which occurred at a bus stop in the Baq'a quarter of Jerusalem in the early 1970s, where my now wife and I encountered a friend of her mother. She was an elderly, traditional Moroccan woman, easily recognizable even before she spoke by her headscarf, her jewelry, and various other cultural clues to those who would know them. My wife introduced me to her, and we chatted in the Judeo-Arabic of Sifru, their hometown in Morocco, a town in which, by the way, I wrote a book on their Judeo-Arabic vernacular, published in England by Manchester. I had at that time begun the study of this vernacular, both in Morocco and Israel. There was still a Jewish community there in the early 70s. And I was delighted by the opportunity to practice my speaking skills. And my wife was clearly delighted to show off her Ashkenazi American husband, who could speak their native language. But a short while later, after the woman had parted, I noticed that my wife had tears in her eyes. And I asked her, what was the problem? And she told me that she suddenly remembered how years earlier, if she saw that same woman from a distance, she would walk blocks out of her way in order to avoid her. This was to avoid the embarrassment of having to speak Moroccan Arabic in public because of the strong prejudice against Jews from Muslim countries, the so-called Mizrahim, or Oriental Jews, and especially Moroccan Jews. There were terrible epithets. One referred to that is, some people referred to Morocco Sakin, Morocco of the knife, as one of these epithets. Women were very often called, actually using a Moroccan diminutive name, Freha, meaning a not very classy woman, and so on. And so in the early 50s and 60s, it was not at all chic to speak Arabic of any kind in public in Israel, and certainly not to be Moroccan. The great irony in these two personal anecdotes is that amongst all of the many diaspora Jewish languages, and there were many, of post-Talmudic times, and these include Yiddish, Ladino, Shwadit or Jewish Provençal, Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Greek, Judeo-French, Judeo-Tat, Judeo-Berber, and still others less well known. I must confess, I didn't know it until I edited the encyclopedia and had to find someone to write an article on it. Judeo-Malayalam, spoken in one province by Jews in India. And it had, of all these languages, a place of special distinction. It had the longest recorded history after the essential Jewish languages of Hebrew and Aramaic. And in a sense, Hebrew and Aramaic were thought of as one language from rabbinic times on. And basically, Judeo-Arabic existed from the 9th century all the way to our present day. It had the widest geographical distribution, extending across 3 continents in the Middle Ages: Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And furthermore, and even more significantly, it was the medium of expression for one of the foremost periods of Jewish cultural and intellectual creativity. Now, the existence of Jewish languages we have to think of as a function of Jewish history. For more than 2 millennia, Jews live scattered. We just had Tisha B'Av commemorating the second destruction of the Jewish Commonwealth. For more than 2 millennia, Jews lived scattered throughout many lands and many cultures. But the transformational effects of their dispersion were mitigated, or at least tempered, by their own cohesion as a group within these far-flung lands in which they lived. They perceived of these lands as galut, as exile, both spiritually and nationally. And wherever they lived, Jews created their own distinct vernaculars that were usually written in Hebrew script and contained considerable amounts of Hebrew Aramaic, and we think of Hebrew Aramaic as one body here, vocabulary. These Jewish idioms differed from their non-Jewish cognates in their pronunciation, their grammar, their syntax, their lexical choices, even within the non-Hebrew root vocabulary. Just to give you an example, in Morocco, Jews used the classical Arabic word ra in their pronunciation, ra'a, to see, whereas Muslims used the later word, which is in most dialects, shuf, shaf. And there are many examples of this throughout the length and breadth of the Arabic-speaking world. And Jews subconsciously created and preserved a unique linguistic identity. Judeo-Arabic may be considered the premier diaspora language. For most of the last 1400 years, Arabic in its Jewish form or forms was spoken by more Jews than any other language. We think, of course, of the Ashkenazim as being this great majority of the Jewish world, but that's only the product of a population explosion that occurred in the beginning of the 18th century. Up until that time, the vast majority of Jews lived in the Islamic world. And from the 7th until the end of the 17th century, the majority of Jews lived in the Dar al-Islam, the domain of Islam. Just where did my map go? Go here, and now go here. There. The majority of Jews lived in this was the Islamic world of the Middle Ages, as it's extending, as you can see, from Spain all the way over to the borders of India and China. And Arabic was the spoken and cultural language by Jews in this great geographical expanse. And although Yiddish spread to the ends of the earth in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Ashkenazi Jews, like my grandparents, poured out of Eastern Europe to the New World, South Africa and Australia, it did not sink long-lasting roots and was quickly abandoned by the second and third generation. Some forms of Judeo-Arabic also spread beyond their original heartlands in the 19th and 20th centuries to the Iraqi trading colonies in India, in Southeast Asia, in Hong Kong, and in Shanghai. And if I just have the, can you all see the Fuzhou Road in Shanghai?
No, we can't, unfortunately.
That was actually on a different line. So in any case, the main business street in Shanghai, the major language was in fact Arabic, and you had people such as the Kaduris, who were in both Hong Kong and Shanghai, among the major merchants. You had people such as let me just the Sassoons. These are all names certainly that everyone in the United Kingdom must know. This is David Sassoon and his sons, who had major businesses throughout Southeast Asia, but particularly in Shanghai. And also, you had Aleppan Jewish colonies in France. And of course, I already noticed the wonderful title of the coming lecture in the lockdown lecture series is may you grow up to live in Manchester, which was a wish at the Brit Milah of someone in Aleppo. You had Aleppan enclaves in England, in France, in the Americas, and you had Yemenite communities in India, in Brooklyn, and elsewhere. And more importantly, however, Judeo-Arabic was the literary medium for some of the greatest works of the Jewish spirit. And this did not include simply Mizrahi Sephardi regional or temporal works, but contributions that belong to the common heritage of Judaism and the Jewish people. In the Judeo-Arabic world, many of the key elements of Judaism as a religious civilization under the constitutional framework of the Talmud were crystallized, were formulated, and systematized. These elements included Jewish law, liturgy, philosophy, theology, scriptural exegesis, Hebrew grammar, lexicography, Hebrew poetry, and belles lettres. These all flowered in the Arabic-speaking world of the Jewish Middle Ages. And I'd like to just now take you on a little tour of the development of this language. Before the spread of Islam, the only Jews who spoke Arabic were those in the Jewish tribes in Arabia, and Jews who lived there lived tribal existences not unlike that of their Arab neighbors. Their everyday language was apparently similar to that of their neighbors, except for Hebrew and Aramaic words that they used to express specifically Jewish religious and cultural concepts. The Arabs referred to this Judeo-Arabic dialect as Yahudiya, as Jewish speech. And some of the Hebrew and Aramaic vocabulary of this early Judeo-Arabic, as well as a number of religious concepts, passed into the speech of the pagan Arabs, and thereafter into Muslim Arabic. Charity in Islam is called sadaqah. Sadaqah. It's a loan word. Fasting. We just had the fast of Tisha B'Av. In Arabic, it's Saum, from Hebrew Tzom. There is a word in Arabic, Saum, in Old Arabic, but it means to keep quiet. It doesn't have anything to do with fasting. And of course, prayer in Islam is called Salat, which is from Aramaic, Salota. And although the Jews of 6th and 7th century Arabia most likely wrote letters and documents in Hebrew characters, they've left behind no Judeo-Arabic literature. In fact, we have nothing from them other than reports about them in Muslim sources. And the only literary art at that time was oral poetry. And the poems preserved in the later Arabic tradition, which include Jewish bards from the period, such as As-Samawal, very famous one, were completely devoid of Jewish content. They belong to the Jahili poetry. Every high school child who learns Arabic in Arabic schools learns some of Samarwell's poems, and they're talking about being tough and being a man and all these other things that fit Arabic poetry and have no Jewish content whatsoever. But then the Muslims poured out of Arabia, and in the 7th and 8th centuries established a domain that stretched from the borders of India and China in the east to the Atlantic and the Pyrenees in the west, as you saw from the map that I showed you before. And the majority of Jews living in the world during this time came under Arab rule. The Arabic language became the lingua franca of this vast empire, taking the place of Aramaic and Greek, which had served as the international languages of culture and administration throughout much of the Middle East and North Africa previously. And as the conquered peoples adopted Arabic, it underwent a variety of metamorphoses, evolving into what we call Middle Arabic, or the Middle Arabic dialects. And this simplified form of the language dropped the case endings of the old Arabic. Arabic, by the way, is like Latin or Greek. It has case endings, and the literary language still does. But in the spoken, all of that disappeared. And because of that, also, it had to transform its syntax from what we call synthetic. That is, Arabic was verb, subject, object, and now it becomes subject, verb, object. Otherwise, you have no idea who's doing what to whom. The Jews also adopted the new international language of culture. And by the 10th century, it not only became their daily vernacular, but also the language they used for most of their written expression. Arabic was used for day-to-day correspondence, as we know from the rich treasure trove of the documents of the Cairo Geniza. And I believe you already had a talk on the Geniza, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Lynn?
We did about a year ago. Yes.
And so just quickly, I can find there we go. As you know, Jews don't, so just quickly, as you know, Jews do not throw away anything that has the name of God on it. And to be on the safe side, anything written in Hebrew characters tended to be first stored in a synagogue and then given a respectful burial. And this is the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo, where the Geniza was found. It contained approximately 250,000 documents, ranging from the 9th all the way up to the 19th century, but most of it from the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. And originally, there was a door, as you can see, the building is very high. Originally, there was a door on the ground floor. Eventually, the documents piled up so that they blocked up the door, knocked a hole in the ceiling, and started dumping them down through that opening up there. Some of them were taken to nearby cemeteries, the Bassettine one in particular. Another 25,000 documents were found there. And these included everything from marriage contracts to children's, the same way we learned Hebrew when I was a little boy, which we used to call the Bor Babu method, to this is a group of witnesses at someone's deathbed, taking his last will and testament. And it starts off the opening in Hebrew, Ma'aseh Shehaya Lefanenu Anu Edim, the matter which came before us, we the witnesses below, and then it goes right into Arabic and what was said and what he was leaving to everyone else. And of course, business letters. There are some 25 or 30,000 business letters from the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. And by the way, you can see people didn't waste paper in the Middle Ages. Not only did you write then, but you then wrote in the margins, and the same goes over on the back. And in fact, my PhD thesis was studying a family's archive of their business and public, because they were communal leaders also, correspondence over a period of 4 generations. By the way, it's absolutely unique. There is no other source, not merely Jewish, but any source from the Middle Ages like it. And the piece that was used for the poster for the talk, this is what would we call it? The forerunner of a check. This is one person writing that his business partner in another city has to give this amount of money to this merchant when he comes there. In any case, this becomes, but this is not only, this is the documentary Geniza, but also it has religious documents. It has responsa, sheilot and tshuvot. It has biblical exegesis, textual commentaries, works of philology, philosophy, theology, and grammar and lexicography. And for linguistic, I must point out, and psychological reasons, this transition to Arabic for the majority of Jews living in this vast Islamic empire was probably not very difficult. Arabic is, after all, a Semitic language with many affinities to Hebrew and Aramaic. About 30% of the words in Arabic are cognate to Hebrew. So that already makes it easier. Secondly, Islam was a strictly monotheistic faith, or religious civilization indeed, based on a notion of divine law that was partially written, partially oral. And in fact, even the notion of law in Islam, Sharia, is the same meaning as halakha in Hebrew. It's the way you go. And they were similar in so many respects that Islam, like Judaism, eschewed religious iconography, and it also didn't manifest the kind of hostility towards Judaism that Christianity did. There is no notion of deicide, the ultimate sin, which Christianity had placed upon Judaism. And in contrast to the Christian world, Jews were not the only subjects belonging to a different faith from the ruling faith. They shared their status with the far more numerous Christians and Zoroastrians. Medieval Islamic civilization was not also totally clerical and feudal like medieval Christian civilization, medieval Christendom. Through the 9th and 12th centuries, the Islamic world witnessed what we call the commercial revolution, the rise of the bourgeoisie, and the revival of Hellenistic science and humanism. And there was a high degree of interconfessional cooperation in the fields of science, philosophy, and commerce. Christianity looked down upon commerce in the Middle Ages, and to a certain extent, all the way into modern times. Islam, like Judaism, held commerce in high regard. There's a book in Arabic from the 11th century called Kitab al-Ishara ila Mahasin al-Tijara, the book that shows the beauties of commerce. The Prophet Muhammad was a merchant. And commerce, medicine, and intellectual fields offered, if you will, a secular playing field in which Jews could participate and participate alongside of Muslims, Christians, and others. And consequently, there were many aspects of Islamic secular culture that Jews found attractive and unthreatening, and they could participate in a symbiotic way. Jews normally, as I said, wrote their Arabic and Hebrew characters because they were already familiar with it from earliest childhood when they were taught for religious purposes. I must confess, I could read Hebrew before I could read English. Of course, when I say read, I could read by rote, but I was 4 years old when I learned the alphabet in order to participate in the Seder. You only start to learn the Latin alphabet when you're in kindergarten. Members of the Jewish intelligentsia could read Arabic script with some degree of proficiency, and some even produced works for a broader audience in the standard Arabic script as well. But it was not uncommon, and we know this again from the Geniza, for Jews to have popular Islamic works, philosophy, science, and so on, recopied from the Arabic script into the Hebrew script for convenient reading. And we know this because we have such books. B, we have orders for this to be done, and C, we have a list of private libraries, so that it was something that they often did. And although Hebrew and Arabic both belong to the Semitic family of languages, Arabic, those of you who know it, has consonants that aren't found in Hebrew. And this was taken care of in Judeo-Arabic by adopting a system of diacritical points. Does it show?
Just about, yes, yes.
So for example, the Hebrew Saadia with a dot over it, like the Arabic Saad with a dot over it, becomes Dod, the emphatic D. Tet with a dot over it becomes Wa, which doesn't exist in Hebrew at all. And then for Rain, the Arabic R, they either used ayin with a dot over it or gimel with a dot over it, which also was used for jim, of the Arabic j, which doesn't exist in Hebrew either. Now, Jews adopted these, and although the system was somewhat haphazard and there were deviations, basically this became the system all the way up to modern times. The Jews in the medieval Islamic world did not write in the vernacular language which they spoke on a daily basis, but they used a literary form of the language, a form somewhere between classical Arabic, which is to this day the only acceptable form of writing in Islamic culture, and local dialects. The Arabic world, you have to understand, is diglossic. That is, you speak one language, but you read and write another. And it's similar to Europe in the Middle Ages, when people spoke what was called vulgar Latin, but of course was just Old Italian, Old Spanish, Old French, etc., until writers came along and gave us people like Dante and Boccaccio, and gave us literature in the vulgar language, which now became the language. This never happened in the Arabic world for Muslims, but Jews did write in this, in a sort of middle version of this, and they had two styles. One was a more classical one for works of philosophy, theology, and so on, Bible translations, commentaries. But then in their correspondence, they wrote in a form that bristled with colloquialisms, and depending on the education of the writer and formal or informal nature of the written material, depends on the level of the language that they were writing. And we can see all of this through the Cairo, what's been preserved in the Cairo Geniza. Now, the rich literary output in medieval Judeo-Arabic was stimulated by the intellectual and spiritual ferment that occurred in the medieval Islamic world during the second half of the 8th century and continuing into the 9th and 10th. And the first Jewish thinker to take up the challenges of these times, rationalism, free thinking. We don't think of these as medieval, we think of this as modern, but you had this at this time, rationalism, free thinking, sectarian movements such as Karaism. The Karaites were the first major sect of Jews to reject the rabbinic tradition and to say you had to go back to the scripture itself, to the Bible. And the person from traditional Judaism who met this challenge was Saadia Gaon, who lived from 882 to 942. And he was the leading rabbinic scholar of his day. And he responded to all of these challenges in the language that was best understood by his fellow Jews, Arabic. He was born in Egypt, became the Gaon, or head of the Surah Academy in Baghdad, and was recognized as one of the highest religious authorities in the Jewish world. And he produced a massive body of writing, not only for scholars, but also for the educated layman as well, to resolve the spiritual confusion of his day, as he puts it, in his great work on Jewish theology. He writes in the introduction that people are confused. You have Muslims, you have Christians, you have Buddhists, you have Hindus, you have philosophers, all claiming to have the truth. And he writes the first serious work of Jewish theology, the Kitab al-Amanat wal-I'tiqadat, the book of doctrines and beliefs, which comes to be known in Europe as Sefer HaEmunot HaDeot. That's, of course, how these works become part of the world Jewish heritage. And he met the challenge of the Karaites on the study of Bible by translating the scripture into Arabic. And if you'll forgive a sort of strange comparison, you can think of it as the Jewish King James of Bible, because his translation becomes influential for all later translations of the Bible, Christian Bible translations and Jewish ones, into Arabic. I can just give you the example. When I was a boy, at least in the United States, the major English Bible for Jews was the Holy Scriptures of the Jewish Publication Society. It's King James English completely. Thou and thine and thee, etc. And you look at the Psalms, it's right out of King James. In any case, this was the effect that his Bible translation, and he wrote also a rational commentary on the Bible. Up until this time, Jewish commentaries on the Bible were all midrashic, homiletic. He writes a rational commentary, and he affects many of the later works of Bible commentary. Abraham ibn Ezra's Hebrew commentary, which is published in Jewish works such as the Mikra'ot Gedolot next to the Hebrew Bible. He takes much of his commentary in Hebrew, lock, stock, and barrel from Saadia. He only quotes Saadia when he disagrees with him. When he agrees with him, he just gives it as is. Saadia also wrote the first dictionary of Hebrew, the Sefer HaAgron, but it's a dictionary of Hebrew words with the explanations in Arabic. And by the way, I should mention to you, Arab civilization in the Middle Ages invented the dictionary as we know it. Although you had word lists and glossaries and so on going back to the ancient Babylonians, you never had a dictionary that gave you the word, its various synonyms, and like OED, how it was used in literature and so on. This he takes from Arabic. He also, by the way, I would point out, produced the first real Siddur, the first Jewish prayer book. And it would be, in a certain way, very familiar to people who have prayer books in diaspora to this day. The instructions are in Arabic for the layman. And also certain things which he thinks needs to be explained are also in Arabic in his Jami' al-Salawat, in his collection of the prayers. He also was the first Jewish scholar, to write specific legal tracts, like the Book of Inheritance, the Kitab al-Mawarith. Up until this time, Jewish legal books were all discussions where one rabbi says this, another says that, and another one says, well, maybe it's still something else. This simply gives it in a neat form for the reader. Now, during this time, a major center of Jewish scholarly activity developed in the far west of the Islamic world, in the North African city of Cairo in today's Tunisia. And just this was the capital of Arab North Africa and the great center of Arabism there, and it became one of the great centers of Jewish culture as well. And oops, no, we don't want that. There we go. Just to show you where Cairo is. Well, you all know where Tunisia is, so we will leave it at that for the time being. Stop share.
It's all right. We can see you now.
Oh, you can. So I'm seeing this, and you are not. There we go. In any case, Cairo became known for the Anshe Cairo, the sages of Cairo, and they were noted in Hebrew literature for their religious and secular learning. The earliest and most famous of these sages was the physician and philosopher Isaac Israeli, who lived almost 100 years, from 850 to 950, and his works were translated into Hebrew and Latin. And if one were a medical student in a European university, up until the founding of modern medicine, one read the works, among others, of Isaac Israeli, who was called the distinguished, the eximius monacha medicinae, the distinguished monarch of medicine. And just there's a Latin edition of his works, which a student at Oxford, Cambridge, or the Sorbonne would have known. There we go. His disciple, Dunash ben Tamim, in addition to being a philosopher and a physician, was a Hebrew grammarian and philologist. And by the way, the first works of Hebrew grammar were written in the Arabic-speaking world, and in fact modeled it on Arabic grammar. So when you learn Hebrew, pa'al, nif'al, pi'el, pu'al, etc., that is based on the Arabic paradigms of fa'ala, fa'ala, af'ala, and so on. They adopted it line and sinker. In the realm of religious scholarship in Kairouan, many figures were produced. Nisim ben Jacob ibn Shaheen wrote an important commentary on the Talmud, of which only small parts are preserved in the printed Talmud today, because those are translated into Hebrew. The rest of it was in Arabic and was not translated. And he wrote one of the first books of what we could call literature of edification, stories which had a moral twist to them. And the book is called the Book of Comfort, the Kitab al-Faraj Ba'ada Shidda, after adversity, and became one of the great classics in medieval Hebrew literature. In Muslim Iberia, Al-Andalus, Sfarad in Hebrew, medieval Judeo-Arabic literary culture reached its apogee. And I spoke earlier on the Jews of Islamic Spain. And under the patronage of courtiers like Hasta ibn Shaprut in Cordoba, Samuel Hanagid ibn Agrela in Granada, Jewish scholars and men of letters produced works on Hebrew grammar, lexicography, prosody, philosophy, all in Judeo-Arabic. Jonah ibn Janah, who flourished in the first half of the 11th century, wrote the most influential grammar, pre-modern grammar of the Hebrew language, which lasted for centuries, and has the very flowery Arabic title of the Book of Variegated Flower Beds. A lot of Arabic books have these rather odd sounding titles because A, they're made to rhyme in Arabic, and we'll talk a bit about rhyme in just a bit. But this one became one of the most important of all Hebrew grammar books for centuries to come. He also completed a dictionary of biblical Hebrew, the Book of Roots, the Kitab al-Usul. Moses ibn Ezra, who lived from 1055 till sometime after 1135, produced the first and most comprehensive study of the art of Hebrew rhetoric and poetry, the Book of Conversation and Discussion, Kitab al-Muhadara wa Mudakara. And this work discusses the art of Hebrew poetry, but it's in Arabic. In other words, this is not that different from an academic today write a book like that in his own language to explain it to others. Solomon ibn Gabirol, Ibn Gvirol, who was known to the schoolmen of Christian Europe as Avisebron, wrote a popular Neoplatonic treatise, The Source of Life. The Arabic original was lost for a long time, but it lived on in its Latin translation as Fons Vitae, and one of the most popular books of Jewish mystical and ethical devotion for later Judaism, the duties of the heart, the Chovavot HaLevavot, is the Kitab al-Hidayah wal-Fara'id al-Qulub of Bahya ibn Pakuda from the second half of 11th century Spain. And of course, Judah Halevi, the greatest of all the Hebrew poets after the Bible, wrote his apologetic for traditional faith against philosophical rationalism, the Kuzari, Kitab al-Khazari, and also it's one of the works of Proto-Zionism. And he wrote, of course, the Songs of Zion, many of which we recited as the Kinot the other morning on Tisha B'Av. These Arabic-speaking Jews in Sepharad produced a rich new Hebrew poetry which used the rhyme, the meters, and many of the themes of classical Arabic poetry. In addition to sublime religious poetry, Jewish poets such as Dunash ben Labrat, Moses ibn Ezra, Solomon ibn Gvirol, Judah Halevi wrote panegyrics to Jewish courtiers and poems celebrating such traditionally un-Jewish subjects as carousing, wine party, poems are very popular. Nature, love, including poems on homoerotic themes. And by the way, there's an enormous debate literature in Israel. How serious were these poems to be taken? Does this represent a real social way of life, or is it simply, as some would say, merely artistic and has no practical value? I won't get into the debate. Poetry was, by the way, the one genre that was written almost exclusively in Hebrew. And contrary to the suggestion of some very great scholars, this was not due to the fact that Jewish poets did not have a sufficient command of classical Arabic, or that they were not sufficiently imbued with the Arabic cultural ideal of al-Arabiya, of Arabness, because we know some Jewish poets, Samuel and his son Joseph ibn Agrela and Ibn Sahal al-Israeli, wrote elegant Arabic verse in classical Arabic. Instead, the reason that overwhelmingly they wrote in Hebrew was because they had so absorbed the values of Arab Islamic society. Poetry in Islamic civilization is the ultimate form of national art. And hence, Jews cultivated Hebrew poetry as a national response to prove that the language of their scripture and their national heritage was in no way inferior to that of the Quran or the Arab poets. And although Hebrew poetry of medieval Iberia was written according to Arabic stylistic modes, one should not consider it to be merely an epigone literature. The Sephardi poets wrote inspired liturgical poems as an ornament to synagogue worship and other religious occasions, like the keynote of Tisha B'Av. And this was a genre that had no parallel whatsoever in Arabic poetry. Sepharad's Judeo-Arabic tradition continued outside of Iberia after the Almohads snuffed out open Jewish life in the Muslim part of Spain. And in Egypt, Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, who died in 1204, saw himself as an Andalusian and the upholder of its intellectual heritage. And he wrote all of his works, with one exception, namely his law code, the Mishnah Torah. All his works are written in Arabic. Much of it is in literary Arabic, that is, this is his works on medicine, philosophy, and so on, the great Guide of the Perplexed, the Dalalat al-Ha'irin, the Moreh Nevuchim. But he also wrote hundreds. He was prolific. We have more than 300 responsa from Maimonides, and these are written in Middle Arabic. And this tradition was continued by the Maimonides family for generations to come. His son Abraham Maimonides, Abraham ben Harambam, who inherited his position as head of the Jews of Egypt, composed his great mystical work of pietism, the complete guide for servants of God, Kifayat al-Abidin, in Judeo-Arabic. It's partially translated into English with the name of one of the books, which I happen to particularly love, The Guide to Perfection. And this continued on for the next 3-4 generations of the Maimonidean family. Now, around the late 15th century, medieval Judeo-Arabic began to give way to modern Judeo-Arabic, or rather to the modern varieties of the language. The main universal characteristic of this later form were its very colloquial nature. And it was much closer to the spoken language than the literary language of the Middle Ages. And this was true all throughout, from Morocco all the way across to Iraq. And the shift from Middle Arabic to the modern communal dialects these forms resulted in part from the increased social isolation of Jews in the Arab world. At the end of the Middle Ages, they were compelled to live in restrictive ghetto-like quarters such as the Malah in Morocco, the Harat al-Yahud in the Middle East. And this isolation, even though they were in this isolation, they never were completely, hermetically isolated. Jews interacted with Muslims on many levels, particularly in the economic and commercial sphere, buying, selling, and providing services to each other. But socially, intellectually, and psychologically, the isolation was far more complete. And the shift from literary medieval written language to the more vernacular forms of Judeo-Arabic also represented an overall decline in the general level of education throughout the Islamic world, not merely of Jews, but of everyone. And for example, the ability to write classical Arabic was seriously deteriorating among Muslims during this period. And we can see this from letters people write to each other that are written in a form of Arabic that would be today unacceptable. One of the great collections I might mention to you of these dialect texts are in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, where I also worked at a later period from the British Library. And there you can see that grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes, dialect words and forms, and these are not Jewish manuscripts. These are Muslim ones. And the high form of Arabic was only revived with the Nahda, the awakening, which is the Arabic form of what Jews call the Haskalah for themselves, which started among Syrian Christians in the second half of the 19th century. But the Nahda held very little appeal to the majority of Arabic-speaking Jews in modern times who didn't identify with Arab culture, much less with Arab nationalism. And a third factor that might have contributed to the decline of the universal medieval literary form of Judeo-Arabic was the mass influx of Sephardi refugees to the major population centers of the Islamic world. The Iberian exiles came from Spain and Portugal, and their forefathers had already given up Arabic culture centuries earlier. The Sephardi rabbinical elite, which became dominant in many of the Arabic-speaking lands and in Turkey and the Balkans, used Hebrew as their primary language of literary expression. And until a generation ago, I would just point out, most scholarly surveys of Judeo-Arabic cultural heritage ended right here. And this was due to a classicist bias that viewed the intellectual, spiritual, and artistic work of the later Middle Ages and early modern times in the Islamic world as essentially decadent. And not untypical was the judgment expressed by a very distinguished Jewish scholar in his article in the Encyclopedia Judaica, surveying Judeo-Arabic literature. He concludes in his final paragraph by dismissing everything written after the 15th century in the following words, and I quote, "It must be admitted that there is little value in these works, most of which are liturgical, exegetic, or translations of Hebrew pietistic works," end quotation. This dismissive judgment was grossly subjective and patently untrue. Modern Judeo-Arabic continued to be the medium of rich and varied cultural heritage, some of whose roots go back into the Middle Ages. There always had existed alongside Arab high culture a vibrant popular culture. During the Middle Ages, very little so-called vulgar literature, such as folk poetry and prose for the mass entertainment, was preserved in writing. The one and best known exception is the 1001 Nights, the Alf Laila wa Laila, and it's now widely considered a classic of world literature. The Jews of the Middle East and North Africa continued to create and consume popular literature in Judeo-Arabic that was not merely of ethnographic or linguistic interest, and it was of that as well, but could truly be appreciated for its own sake and judged on its own terms. Both men and women from Morocco in the West across to Yemen in the East composed a variety of poetic genres, ranging from the more literary qasida, the ode, to the folk muwal and the arobi in Judeo-Arabic. And some of this poetry was written and some of it was entirely oral. Even illiterate women could compose sophisticated Judeo-Arabic poetry and compete in singing duels because they sung the poetry, comparable to such contests in the medieval Arab world, which were called Naqayid, and in medieval Christian world among troubadours in Provence, the tonsons. I myself was in attendance in Sifru in the early 1970s, where two women, one of whom, the really good one, was totally illiterate, traditional woman, and she composed high-level poetry, and in her duel with a younger literate woman, one woman would start it off, do a verse, then taking something from the last line of one verse, the other would answer with a whole new paragraph of poetry. Now, this continued, as I said, all the way into the 1970s. Most of the works of rabbinical high culture, I said, were written in Hebrew, but there were, in the Arabic-speaking world, also a tradition, a living tradition of what we call calque translations, that is, literal translations of religious texts such as the Bible, the Mishnah, and the Haggadah, which were used, they were in the local vernacular, and they were used for the edification of adults who had only a limited knowledge of Hebrew, and for the teaching of youngsters. And these translations, which were usually called sharh in Arabic, but also tafsir and maqshiyah, they included most of the religious texts. And I myself had been in Casablanca in the major synagogue in the afternoon when the rabbi gave a lesson on whatever they were studying at the time, and gave the text, the Hebrew text, he gave them in this sharh translation. There were also scriptural commentaries written in Arabic in this style. The great Rabbi Raphael Verdugo, who died in 1821 in Meknes, Morocco, and is known as the Angel Raphael, Hamalach Raphael, authored one such commentary. It's multi-volume, called Lishon Limudim. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Judeo-Arabic newspapers and periodicals began to appear in the Middle East. Here is one of the earliest, the Al-Hurriya, which came out in Tangier. The name of it means freedom. Or you also remember I said that you had Iraqi Jews all the way across into India and China. And no, you're not seeing this, are you?
We are.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. It said screen sharing stopped. So this newspaper was called Megid Misharim. We could say it tells it like it is, if you'll allow me a free American translation. It tells it straight. And this is a Judeo-Arabic newspaper from Calcutta in the 19th century, because of the important Jewish mercantile community that lived there. You had them in most of the major cities in the 19th and into the 20th centuries, and they were never as numerous as the thousands of such journals in Yiddish in Europe, or the hundreds in Ladino in Turkey and the Balkans. However, these Judeo-Arabic newspapers and magazines served a similar function to their Yiddish and Ladino counterparts as vectors of modernization. They not only conveyed local and world news, but they also discussed specifically Jewish issues: Zionism, secularism, Westernization, anti-Semitism. And they also serialized and adapted modern European novels and short stories, which, by the way, was typical anyway in Europe in the 19th century. Many of the great works of both English and French fiction appeared as series in newspapers before they were published as complete books. And for example, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo. It's just, here we go. There you've got, you don't even have to know Arabic to be able to read the title, although the beginning of it you do. The top says Hikayat, the story of Robinson Crusoe. Tunisia by far had the largest number of Judeo-Arabic periodicals of any country, and the biggest Judeo-Arabic publishing houses in the Arab world. Now, after World War I, Judeo-Arabic journals increasingly gave way to French publications from Morocco all the way across to Egypt, due to the tremendous influence of the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools and the impact of French colonial rule in the Maghrebi countries. And I would just point out that by the year 1900, already 100,000 Jewish children had gone through the doors of the Alliance schools from Morocco across to Turkey and Iraq. They come into Iran only in the beginning, in the beginning of the 20th century. But across that and French becomes the lingua franca from this point on. In Iraq and Lebanon, where modern Arabic culture made its strongest impression, and French was still very important, but there the Jews who did publish Arabic newspapers published them in modern standard Arabic, as of the 1920s. There were a few Judeo-Arabic periodicals that continued to be published in Morocco, Tunisia, and Libya until the mass exodus of people from these countries after the establishment of the State of Israel. And several Judeo-Arabic periodicals appeared in the new homeland to serve the new immigrants in the early years following their arrival, just as there were news broadcasts in Judeo-Arabic when I first came to work in Israel in the 60s and 70s. But of course, all of that is, in fact, I even once was a guest on the Moroccan Arabic news program and gave a talk on Aliratza Dialna, our cultural heritage. Modern Judeo-Arabic never became a medium for original belletristic expression. Most of the world-class Middle Eastern and North African novelists, Jewish novelists, such as Naim Qatan from Iraq, Albert Memmi from Egypt, from Tunisia, wrote their books in French. And a number of important Jewish writers in Iraq, such as Anwar Shaul, Murad Mikhael, and Shalom Darwish, wrote in modern standard Arabic. But these are the exceptions, not the rule. And one or two of these latter continued writing in Arabic even after immigrating to Israel. There were some Judeo-Arabic plays, both original and translations. For example, Moliere's the Al-Bakhil in Arabic,
The miser?
Kaiser, thank you. Is, and I have seen it here done in Israel in Moroccan Arabic. Usually there are 2 or 3 plays a year here in Jerusalem in Judeo-Arabic at one of two theaters. You also have modern Judeo-Arabic serving to introduce Arabic-speaking Jews to Western literary genres in translation, and not only to French and English novels, plays, and short stories, but to the new Hebrew fiction of the Haskalah movement. And just for one example, Avraham Mapu's novel, for one of the earliest Zionist works, the Ahavat Zion, the Love of Zion, appeared in no less than 3 Judeo-Arabic translations, starting in Tunis in 1890 as Al-Hub wal-Watan, Love in the Homeland, and it was later translated in Egypt and elsewhere. Now, only a handful of Jews remain in the Arab world today. The overwhelming majority of Jews from Arab lands and their descendants live in Israel, France, and elsewhere, some in Canada, which has a large community as well. And like Yiddish and Ladino, Judeo-Arabic is, I'm sorry to say, a dying language. But the cultural heritage of Judeo-Arabic is anything but moribund. Judeo-Arabic words and expressions entered into modern Israeli Hebrew to no less and perhaps a greater extent than Yiddishisms penetrated into American English. And just to give you a few examples, for example, in Hebrew slang, we can say, Arbit Shena, I'm going to beat asleep, meaning I'm going to take a nap. Arbit Schia, this is a literal translation of North African Arabic, Durb al-Alma, Durb al-Na'as, and so on. One of the most popular children's books in Israel is Yomano Shel Chnun, Diary of a Wimpy Kid. But those of you who know Arabic know that Chnun is snot running from the nose. And I don't know if in British English, but in American English, we say he's a snot-nosed kid. And this is that kind of usage. And of course, films in Judeo-Arabic. Just one example, if I've got it here. Yes, there it is. Shchur, which of course, magic. This is a film mostly in Moroccan, 90% of it is in Moroccan Arabic. Most of the actors are Moroccan Israelis who could do it. But others as well. Mafria Hayonim, the Pigeon Breeder, which is a novel by Eli Amir. That was done in Iraqi Jewish Arabic. There are not many actors who speak it other than, what's his name? I knew his brother very well. Unfortunately, I'm of an age where names of people I easily forget. But in any case, the movie makes use of Arabic actors and people who speak other Arabic dialects, and those who are attuned to it. For example, they have an Israeli Arab woman playing a well-known Jewish singer. But of course, she has a fairly heavy Palestinian accent in the Arabic. But still, in all, it's they had a coach who tried to get them to do it in Iraqi Arabic. And there was a Tunisian French film made, the Chant des Mariés. It's called Wedding Song in English, and it also is in Judeo-Arabic. The Tizmorat Al-Andalusit, the Andalusian orchestra, is popular in Israel, playing and not only North African music, but songs in Judeo-Arabic. And of course, the humor. One of the things that so marks Jewish culture is the wit and wisdom of the language. Perhaps because the art of irony and satire are special to minority groups who need a sense of humor to survive, and because they don't have any other weapons with which to fight back. And I'll just give you two, since I began with two personal anecdotes, allow me to end with them as well, from personal experience. We were in the office of a Jewish businessman in Morocco, in Meknes, a man of our acquaintance. And another man comes in who owed him money for a long time. And when the debtor arrived, he's effusively warm, and he's embracing and kissing his hands and kissing his shoulders and kissing his cheeks. And the businessman, who was a pretty tough character, replies with pointed irony, and you'll notice in rhyme, how about cutting down on the kissing and coming up with more money? One other, I'm always amazed, by the way, that people can do this. It's not something that we're, at least in American English, that we're used to doing. But this ability to come up with humorous rhymed comebacks, as I said, never ceases to impress me. And I've seen it to put to all sorts of use, including diffusing or relaxing tense situations. Once, my late wife and I were in a car on a narrow road from Rabat to Fez, in which we barely avoided a head-on collision. And my wife exclaimed to the driver, "Ah, zatzli wahl khila." Oh, that really gave me a scare. And of course, all of us were in that crowded car felt the same way. But the wife of the man driving eased the situation and got a laugh out of all of us by replying, you'll notice again in rhyme, "Ewa, hasan al-khila min al-bila." Well, better a fright than a blow or smash. And again, this ability, this rich ability to look at life in Judeo-Arabic. Many an Israeli comedian still does it, sometimes translating it into Hebrew, but people appreciate this the same way that people appreciate the wit and wisdom of Yiddish, even in its English translation.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Stillman. That was an amazing linguistic tour of Judeo-Arabic and its heritage. I'm just having a look to see what questions we've got here. Can you see them yourself?
No, oh, that's in the chat box then.
In the chat box, yes.
Okay. Yes, someone commenting on not wanting us in the new state. The Atlas and Berberic speaking Jews were speaking Judeo-Berberic. The second day of Pesach, they translated the Haggadah into absolutely. And sounds like the mafia. These anecdotes demand a memoir. Yes, I've sometimes thought of that. My my kids have sometimes asked me. Actually, my son asked for a list because some of these proverbs and so on are so rich and juicy that he asked me to make him a list of them. Let's see. I'm not seeing direct questions.
I think there's one from David J.
Here's one.
Yes. How similar is the Judeo-Arabic dialect of Syrians to the one spoken in the Atlas region?
Good question. The answer is very different. One of the dead giveaway, I did, of course, being having a PhD in Oriental Studies, I had to study for many years Fusha, classical Arabic. When here in Israel, I like to make conversation with taxi drivers and so on if I feel they look friendly. But usually 2 minutes into the conversation, I'll get, and I'm trying to speak in a sort of middle level dialect, which we call Wusta, which is adapting your speech to the speech of the other dialect as far as you can. And I remember someone saying to me, this was actually in Jordan once, Hadratik min Jazair, is Sir from Algeria? And at first I felt so good. Gosh, the accent must be that good that he thought I'm a native speaker. And my wife whispers to me, in this part of the world, that's not a compliment. The answer is some Arabic dialects are mutually intelligible and some are not. Moroccan, Algerian, when spoken the way Moroccans and Algerians speak to each other, is very hard for Middle Easterners to understand. You would have to really adjust your speech. Just as, by the way, as a good example, Portuguese understand Spaniards much more easily than Spaniards understand Portuguese. It's also, of course, who makes the effort to do so. But I learned this once at a conference in Spain, in which we were from all over the world on Jewish subjects, and we spoke in either French, Spanish, or Portuguese. And as I said, the Portuguese understood the French and the Spanish understood the French, but they didn't understand the Portuguese. And Arabic dialects are as different as one Romance language from another. And so, again, Spanish and Italian can get by making certain adjustments, can't have a great philosophical conversation, but the same thing, North Africa, but Syria, you asked about Syrians could understand Tunisians with much greater ease than they can understand Moroccans or Algerians. And that's in part because the pronunciation is so different. The two far west dialects swallow a lot of the vowels. And just to give you an example, kataba is to write in classical Arabic, katab in standard Arabic across the Arabic world, and in Moroccan, it's ktib. So you have to have a pretty good ear to hear that.
Okay. Let's see what else we've got there.
Yes, there is. I can't get it to go up. There we go. Now it went too far up. If you can find the question, it was a question right above that question.
Right, I think I've got it from Sam. In ancient times, what was the interaction between the Jewish and Arabic scholars?
Well, in the Middle Ages, they belonged to a, if you will, an intellectual fraternity, and that, for example, we know we have an Arab traveler from Spain who comes to Baghdad in the 10th century. And he writes an account of it. Spain isn't yet this great center of culture. It's peripheral. And he says, I come to this center where intellectuals, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Zoroastrians have these philosophical discussions. And one of them quotes from his scriptures, and the other said, no, you don't accept our scriptures. We don't accept yours. You have to speak to us according to the rules of logic. And he said, I went to another place and another place, and it was the same disaster everywhere. People had these, we know they had salons for intellectuals to meet. And again, look, medicine. The Arabs wrote these great encyclopedias, including biographical ones. And we have a great encyclopedia of the doctors of the Middle Ages. And it is it gives the biographies of all the great doctors through the centuries in the Arab world, and it lists Christians, Jews, along with Muslims, with there's no stain attached to it. It's said he's a Christian, he's a Jew, but other than that, he's a great it says he's a great scientist. He invented this medicine, and hospitals. The first place to have hospitals as we understand them was the medieval Islamic world. Hospitals in ancient Greece and Rome and in medieval Europe were religious institutions. They were in monasteries in Europe. They were the Aesculapium in ancient Greece, where priests were, or monks were the doctors. In the Islamic world, the very word for hospital, Bimaristan, which was Persian, just means place for the sick, had doctors of all religious confessions, and they served people of all religious confessions. And so again, remember I said this is so different from the Arab world in later times, but there was this secular playing field in which the business, medicine, science, and philosophy could be conducted. And that was, and people had this kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one question about how early was Judeo-Arabic printed? That's from Shula. Yes.
We already had, as you know, printing comes into the Islamic world first with Jews. With the exile from Spain, with the expulsion, the first printing presses are brought to Constantinople, to Morocco, to Salonika, Damascus, and so on. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire permitted them to be brought in on the condition that they would never use Arabic type, only Hebrew. We jokingly tell the students that's because the Arab scribes, the Islamic scribes, had a good union and kept it out. Most of these things that were printed, however, were in Hebrew or Aramaic. But already by the 18th century in Syria and in the 19th century in Tunisia, you have Judeo-Arabic actually being printed in the Arabic speaking world.
Yes, we are privileged to have with us Ilana Tahan of the British Library. I'm sure you have several examples of printed.
I totally agree with what Professor Stillman has just stated, because we in the British Library have the first book ever printed in Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century by the Ibn Nahmias brothers, who came from the Iberian Peninsula. And this book was the first book in any language to be printed in the Ottoman Empire. Turkish came to be printed much later. Likewise, the first book printed in Fez was a Hebrew book. Yes, and we know about that. The first ever book in any language, there is a unicum in the British Library. It's a Bible, Chumash, printed in Faro in Portugal. That was, we have the only example of such book, the only copy extant in the world. And it was the first Hebrew book in any language, printed in Portugal. So yes, we were the pioneers of printings.
Which, by the way, for those of you who are book collectors, that is why early printed Hebrew books are not as expensive as incunabula for Latin works and so on, because, and this was one of the reasons that, for example, that the Sephardic Rite and the Lurianic Kabbalah spread with so thoroughly and with such alacrity throughout the Islamic world because of the introduction of Hebrew printing. And that is simply the first Ottoman printing press that uses Arabic script was for the military academy, and that's only at the end of the 18th century. And the first Arabic printing press is, well, first Napoleon brings it in when he conquers Egypt, but he takes it out with him as well. He used it for announcements and so forth. But then Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt after Napoleon, he introduces the first Arabic printing press into Egypt somewhere around in the 18 teens, 17 to 16 and so on. And that's the famous Bulaq press. And books of that, I actually owned some of them, but living in Israel, you can't live in big houses like in the United States. And so my library is now the Stillman collection at Ben Gurion University. But I do have an agreement with them. Whatever I need for my work, they lend back to me.
Very good.
Without charge.
Without charge, yes.
Okay, just Sean wants to know, what year was the Pharaoh Chumash from? Would you know that?
Well, it's an incunable. It's
Right.
a book printed before 1501, and the date is approximately 1589, as far as I know. But as I said, it's a unicum. There is no other copy known, and everybody that comes to the British Library wants to see this book because it's such a revelation, really. Only one extant in the world. But to come back to the Judeo-Arabic, I just wanted to add, if I may, Professor Stillman and Lynn,
Please.
that in terms of Judeo-Arabic printing, we do have a very excellent collection of Judeo-Arabic from Baghdad, from Iraq, and also Iraqi printing houses in India, Calcutta, Pune, and this date from the 19th century,
Right.
mostly. We also have North African Judeo-Arabic as well, but a much smaller collection.
Okay, well, I think on that amazing note, I mean, we've still got a lot of people here with us, and it is a fascinating subject. We could go on for quite a long time, but I think we need to beat the sleep, as you put it.
Yes.
So it just remains for me to thank you so much, Noam, for a most fascinating talk. And I think your enthusiasm really comes across for this subject. Sorry, Kevin, you wanted to know about, sorry, this is just one last question from Kevin. Is the background of medicine, philosophy, and mathematics because of the ancient Greeks?
And the answer is yes. The Arab world had a government-sponsored program to translate the great works of Greek science and philosophy, and science and philosophy were one corpus in any case, into Arabic. There was an institution founded by the Caliph Al-Ma'mun in Baghdad in the early 9th century, called the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. And it was run by Christian who were in the service of the Caliph, although there were Jews who were also involved in the program. And they systematically translated all of Greek science and philosophy into Arabic, created a whole vocabulary, and the only thing they didn't translate was Greek belles lettres, the Iliad, the Odyssey, poetry. And of course, the reason for that is the Arabs had their own. And but whereas mathematics, geometry, Euclid was translated into Arabic. And then, and of course, because these were practical things. And many of the great works of medicine, pharmacology, De Materia Medica of Dioscorides, great work on pharmacology, translated to Arabic. And by the way, the classical translation of it was by Hasdai ibn Shaprut. Jews were heavily involved in this, and then later on, they were involved in the program in the translation school of Toledo in Christian Spain to translate it from Arabic to Hebrew and Hebrew to Latin. There is Moritz Steinschneider, one of the great founders of Jewish studies in the Wissenschafts des Judentums school of Germany in the 19th century, wrote a classical work called Die Hebräische Übersetzung im Mittelalters und die Juden als Dolmetscher. The Hebrew translations from Arabic the Jewish translations from Arabic in the Middle Ages, and the Jews as cultural intermediaries. And most of the great works of classical science and philosophy had been lost to Christian Europe with the fall of the Roman Empire. They had a few minor treatises from ancient Greece, but that's all. And all of this comes in via Jews and Christians in Spain later on. And that then introduces the Renaissance, which then takes off from there.
It is an absolute privilege to listen to you. You're so erudite, and thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there's plenty of material for another lockdown lecture here.
Okay.
Thank you once again.
Thank you.
And thank you everybody for joining us. As Noah mentioned, our next lockdown lecture takes us to Manchester. And of course, when newborn had his Brit in Aleppo, the blessing was, and may he live in Manchester. So we have Rabbi Ariel, who will be talking about Manchester, the Sephardim in Manchester on the 17th of August. And I do hope you will join us then. Okay.